The night sky was black. No moon, just stars scattered like salt across darkness. And below those stars, somewhere in the wilderness between Egypt and freedom, 600,000 men were walking. Add women and children, maybe 2 million people total, moving through sand and stone with everything they owned on their backs. They'd left Egypt days ago, left behind the only home most of them had ever known, left the pyramids, the Nile, the slavery. Pharaoh had finally let them go after the plagues. 10 catastrophes that turned the most powerful nation on earth into a graveyard. The final plague took every firstborn son in Egypt in a single night. Every household except those marked with lamb's blood on their doorposts. After that, Pharaoh didn't just permit them to leave, he begged them. But here's what happens with tyrants. They change their minds. 3 days into the journey, word reached Moses. Pharaoh's chariots were coming, not a patrol, not a warning. The entire army, 600 chariots, elite forces, warriors who'd crushed rebellions across the known world, and they were moving fast. Imagine the sound first, a low rumble building on the horizon, then dust clouds rising against the sky, then the unmistakable thunder of horses at full gallop, iron wheels on hard ground, the clink of armor and weapons, getting louder, getting closer. Panic spread through the camp like fire. People started shouting, crying, families clutching children, old men looking back toward the dust cloud with faces that had seen too much suffering already. And someone, we don't know who, screamed the question everyone was thinking. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? Think about that sentence. The bitterness, the sarcasm, the absolute terror wrapped in accusation. They'd watched God demolish Egypt with supernatural precision. They'd walked out free after 400 years of bondage. And now, 3 days later, they were convinced it was all a setup. A cruel joke. Freedom dangled in front of them just long enough to make the death worse. Moses stood between two impossibilities. Behind them, an army designed to kill. Ahead of them, water. Not a river you could wade across, not a stream you could ford. The Red Sea, or more accurately, the Yam Suph, the Sea of Reeds. Scholars debate the exact location. Some say the Gulf of Suez. Others point to the Gulf of Aqaba or the Bitter Lakes region. The geography matters less than what everyone standing there understood perfectly. There was no way across, no boats, no bridge, no time to build anything, just deep water stretching to the horizon. 2 million people trapped between drowning and slaughter. Moses raised his staff, not his hand, his staff, that same rod that had turned into a serpent in Pharaoh's court. That had struck the Nile and turned it to blood. That had brought frogs and gnats and flies. That had signaled hail and locusts and darkness. Now he lifted it toward the sea. What happened next, the text describes with strange calmness. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night. All night, not instantly. For hours, wind hammered the water. Hours of waiting while the chariots drew closer. Hours of watching and wondering if anything would actually change. And then, as dawn broke, they saw it. The water was standing up, not receding gradually like a tide going out. Standing. Vertical walls of water on the right and on the left, and between them, dry ground. Not mud, not marsh, dry ground. The text emphasizes this twice. The Israelites walked through on dry ground. The seabed had been exposed and somehow hardened enough to support 2 million people, moving with livestock and carts and everything they owned. Picture the crossing itself. The walls of water on either side. Could you see through them? Were there fish suspended mid-swim, trapped in the unnatural stillness? Did the walls shimmer or roar or stand silent? The text doesn't say, it just records the movement. All night they crossed. families holding hands in the darkness, children wide-eyed, animals skittish but moving forward. The ground solid beneath their feet, where hours before there'd been nothing but depth. By morning, everyone was across, and the Egyptians, seeing the path, charged in after them, 600 chariots funneling into the corridor between the water walls, horses at full speed, soldiers shouting, wheels churning the seabed. They made it halfway, maybe more, close enough that the Israelites on the far shore could see their faces, close enough to finish what they'd started. Then Moses stretched out his staff again, and the water returned. Not slowly. The text says the sea returned to its normal course. Returned. Like something held back finally released. The walls collapsed inward. Chariots overturned. Horses screamed. Men in full armor sank like stones. The entire army, every chariot, every soldier, gone in minutes. And when the water settled, the Israelites stood on the far shore staring at bodies washing up on the sand. The same warriors who'd terrified them hours before. Dead. Delivered by water. The question isn't whether this story is important. It's shaped 3 major world religions. It's been painted, filmed, debated, and preached for thousands of years. The question is simpler and harder. Could this have actually happened? And if so, how? Some calculations put the size of the opening at roughly 2 miles wide to allow that many people to cross in one night. The depth of the Red Sea in various locations ranges from 200 feet to over 9,000 feet in the Central Trench. Even in shallower areas near the coasts, you're talking about substantial bodies of water. For walls of water to stand vertically while the seabed dries enough to support millions of people and animals, you're describing something that violates every principle of fluid dynamics we understand. But here's where it gets complicated, because there are details in the text that don't sound like mythology, the east wind. Why specify direction? Why mention that it blew all night? Myths tend toward the immediate and spectacular. Gods speak, things happen. This account includes waiting, process, environmental details, the kind of specifics you'd expect from someone describing something they witnessed, even if they didn't understand the mechanism. And there's the location debate itself. If this were pure legend, you'd expect a clear, mythological geography. Instead, scholars argue over whether it was the Gulf of Suez, the Gulf of Aqaba, the Bitter Lakes, or Lake Sabonis. The text uses Yam Suph, which literally means sea of reeds. That's odd naming for what we think of as the Red Sea. Reeds don't grow in deep salt water. They grow in marshes, shallow areas, places where wind might, theoretically, have more dramatic effects on water levels. So what are we looking at? A supernatural event that defies physics, a perfectly timed natural phenomenon, something that happened but not the way we picture it, or a story that captures something true about liberation and divine intervention without being a literal historical record. The text itself doesn't seem concerned with proving anything. It just tells what happened. Water stood up. People walked through. An army drowned. And on the far shore, finally safe, the people sang. The oldest song recorded in Scripture. Moses and Miriam leading the celebration. Not analyzing, not explaining, just singing about the horse and rider thrown into the sea. But if we're going to ask whether it really happened, we need to look at more than just the physics of water. We need to look at what happened after. Because here's what gets lost in the debate about walls of water and wind dynamics. Something changed that night. Something so profound that it echoed through the next 3,000 years. A generation of slaves became a nation. Think about what they'd been. Brickmakers, laborers, property, people whose children were thrown into rivers, people who'd forgotten they had a history beyond suffering. And now they're standing on the opposite shore, watching their oppressors' bodies wash up on the sand. The psychological shift alone is staggering. Every military analyst will tell you the same thing. Armies don't just need weapons, they need belief. They need the conviction that victory is possible. that they can face what's coming and survive. Israel had none of that when they left Egypt. They panicked at the first sign of pursuit. They were ready to surrender, to go back to slavery, because at least slavery was familiar. But after the sea, different people entirely. 40 years later, when Joshua sends spies into Jericho, a woman named Rahab tells them something remarkable. She says the people of Canaan have been terrified for decades, not because of Israel's military prowess, they had none, but because of what happened at the sea. We've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. 4 decades later, nations are still afraid of what happened that night. That's not the legacy of a lucky escape. That's the legacy of an event so dramatic, so widely witnessed, that it became the defining moment of an entire people's identity. Consider the logistics of transmitting a false story. You'd need every survivor to maintain the same fabrication. Every family, every tribe. 12 tribes, remember, who spent most of their history fighting each other. Tribes who split into separate kingdoms, who had every political reason to discredit each other's claims. Yet they all tell the same story. The Passover, the sea, the drowning of Pharaoh's army. No competing versions, no alternative traditions, just this. And they didn't just tell it, they ritualized it. The Passover meal became the center of Jewish life. Every year, every family, retelling the story. Not as distant history, but as present reality. We were slaves. God brought us out. You don't build your entire calendar around a metaphor. The Egyptian records predictably say nothing. Empires don't memorialize defeats. Ramesses II, probably the pharaoh of the Exodus, spent his reign carving propaganda into stone. He turned a strategic stalemate at Kadesh into a glorious victory in every temple inscription. You think he's going to record losing his entire army in a failed pursuit of escaping slaves? Silence doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means it's exactly what you'd expect if it did. But there's something else in the text that deserves attention. The song they sang on the far shore isn't simple. It's sophisticated poetry, complex structure, careful wordplay, the kind of composition that suggests either immediate divine inspiration or careful later crafting by someone with serious literary skill. The Lord is a warrior, the Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea. That's not primitive folklore, that's artistry, and it's attributed to Moses, who, according to the text, was educated in Pharaoh's court, who would have received the finest training available in the ancient world, who could absolutely have composed something this refined. The question of what happened keeps circling back to the same tension. If you reject the supernatural entirely, you have to explain why this particular story became the foundation of Jewish identity, why it's referenced more than any other event in Scripture, why Jesus frames his own death as a new Exodus, why Paul calls Christ our Passover lamb. The entire theological framework of both Judaism and Christianity is built on this event being real. But if you accept it as purely supernatural, you're left asking why God works this way sometimes and not others. Why dramatic intervention here, but silence in countless other moments of suffering throughout history? Maybe the answer isn't choosing between natural and supernatural. Maybe what happened was something that sits in that uncomfortable space where the two meet. A wind, real wind, blowing all night, lowering water levels in shallow areas near marshland, creating a window, temporary, dangerous, but passable for people on foot, and then the same wind, the same conditions, becoming a death trap for heavy chariots, wheels bogging in mud, water returning, panic, chaos. Natural, yes, but the timing, the precision, the fact that it happened exactly when needed, exactly where needed, exactly how needed. That's where the supernatural question lives, not in defying physics, but in the orchestration of physics, not in violating natural law, but in the perfect alignment of the natural events. The text itself seems almost uninterested in explaining the mechanism. It focuses on the result: liberation, salvation, the transformation of a people. And that transformation wasn't temporary. 3,000 years later, every Passover, Jewish families still say, "We were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out with a mighty hand." Not our ancestors, we, present tense, personal, immediate. That's what the crossing of the sea created. Not just a historical event, but an eternal present. A story that remakes every generation that tells it. So did it happen? Here's what we know for certain. Something occurred that was significant enough to birth a nation. Something dramatic enough to terrify surrounding kingdoms for generations. Something specific enough to anchor an entire religious calendar. Something real enough that people built their lives around it for 3 millennia. Whether the water stood in walls or wind exposed a mudflat. Whether it was purely supernatural or divinely orchestrated natural phenomena. What's undeniable is the result. A people who had been property became a nation with a purpose. A rabble of escaped slaves became the carriers of monotheism, the idea that changed the world. And they traced it all back to one night, one crossing, one moment when the impossible became real and everything changed. The waters stand or they don't. The mechanism matters or it doesn't. But the liberation was real. The transformation was real. The story that emerged from that shore was real enough to reshape human history. And it all started with one step into the sea. Maybe that's the real question. Not whether Moses split the Red Sea, but whether we're asking the right question at all. Because standing on that far shore, watching bodies wash up in the morning light, nobody was debating physics. Nobody was calculating wind speeds or water displacement. They were singing, weeping, staring at their hands like they'd never seen them before. Free hands. Hands that belong to themselves. The story doesn't end with answers. It ends with a song, with Miriam grabbing a tambourine and dancing, with a people who'd been too afraid to hope suddenly unable to contain their joy. And every year after, when they told this story to their children, they didn't start with, "Here's what probably happened." They started with, "We were slaves, we were trapped, we were terrified, we were dead. And then we weren't." That's what survives, not the explanation, but the experience, the memory of standing between two walls of water, of walking through on ground that shouldn't exist, of making it to the other side when every logical outcome said you wouldn't. 3,000 years of people have found themselves in that same story, trapped, terrified, staring at impossible obstacles with destruction closing in behind them. And something about this ancient night keeps whispering the same message. The sea can part. The impossible can happen. There's a path through even when there isn't. Whether that's literal or metaphorical might be the wrong question entirely. Because for the people who've needed it most, the story doesn't ask permission to be true. It just stands there like walls of water, defying explanation, demanding a decision. You can analyze it forever, or you can step through and see what's on the other side.